Hi again, everyone. We're back here for Chapter 2 now in Anthropology 105, World Archaeology. Last chapter we went over the methods of doing excavation, of survey, of analysis. How do you get the raw data? But data doesn't have a voice. Data doesn't speak on its own. Don't speak, I should say. Data is plural. So we have to say something about it. We have to be able to interpret data. And so this chapter goes through some of the major movements in archaeology. Frankly, I think that there's more to say about this. And so I'm going to have a supplementary lecture that I hope will sort of break down this a little bit further and explain maybe even more in depth than the book does. I'll be covering some of the same subject matter, but I'll also give a case study of how we can actually approach a particular problem and solve it. We'll look at what is an empire and how do we describe that and how do we see that and observe that in the archaeological record. And we'll use the methods that we have in Chapter 2 to try and tease that out of data that has been recovered from a site that I've worked on. So the learning objectives, again, we're going to start there. So after reading this chapter, you should understand, at least in terms of what the book is trying to achieve, is the process by which the depth of human antiquity was recognized. So in other words, you should know a little bit about how archaeology, even though people have been interested in the past and digging things up, the concept of how old humanity is and how far back we go is something that really came out of the Enlightenment. And it's something that we've only been really practicing for a couple hundred years in terms of a scientific discipline. And the second learning objective is to draw your attention to the development of an explicitly scientific approach to archaeology by the 1960s new archaeologists, also known, well, this as processual archaeologists. Slightly different, but the concept of processual archaeology came out of this injection of scientific ways of thinking about the past, not just sort of trying to draw grand narratives through from historical examples, and trying to really get down to the granular level of these data that can help build up a mosaic. But of course, this bottom-up approach that the new archaeologists started to implement through processualism, this bottom-up approach, was challenged by people saying, well, what picture are you building? You have all these data, but where do they go? And maybe it's not, you're assuming that they should go here and here and here. And maybe we need to actually think about the way systems work, the way humans operate, and maybe you're bringing your own biases, your own impressions of the way the world works today, and then superimposing it on the past. And so this was a critique in the 1970s and 80s of processualism that was called post-processualism. And so the questions raised, the third point that the book would like you to learn is the questions raised about scientific approach by post-processual archaeology. Now, those are some pretty big topics. I'm personally of the mind that more or less this processualist, post-processualist debate now in 2020 is a historical debate. Some of the shield bearers of these movements, Colin Renfrew was one of the early proponents of processualism, and he still considers himself a processualist. And one of the big shield bearers of post-processualism, Ian Hodder, has now undertaken excavation on one of the most complex sites in the world, and has found that actually a lot of his ideas, his meta theories, his philosophizing doesn't really work very well when you're getting down to the nitty gritty. And the good news is they've listened to each other. So these people that were critiquing and arguing against one another listened to each other's good ideas, and we've sort of met somewhere in the middle. And you have a processualist like Colin Renfrew who talks about cognitive processualism. So he's actually like, okay, sure, we need to understand the way humans work. I still going to look at the data, but we need to sort of theorize this a little bit better. And Ian Hodder now talks about the reflexive methodology of excavation, because he's like, okay, I accept that some of these ideas are good on paper, but in practice of doing archaeology, you have to really first collect the data and build up your ideas from that. So we will cover these things, but I also want you to acknowledge that we've sort of broken through this a little bit. It doesn't mean that we're done discussing the way humans work and the way humans worked in the past. If anything, we have more theories today. But this processualist versus post-processualist debate is one that's largely a history of science at this point. Now, archaeology as a scientific and academic discipline is like I said, only a few hundred years old. But people have been interested in antiquity for a long time. You find ancient excavations of ancient stuff. The interest in ancient objects early on were neither archaeological nor scientific to begin with. Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, excavated temple ruins to rededicate them to deities. That is not archaeological or scientific. Tutmosis IV, he excavated the Sphinx at Giza because he thought that the sun god would make him pharaoh if he did so. Also not archaeological or scientific, but it is excavating, it is digging things up from the past. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries AD, there was an increasing, and this is the Age of Enlightenment, there was an increasing allowance and curiosity about the past. The church's grip on our way of thinking was starting to loosen a tiny bit. And this left room for curious academics to actually ask some questions that had previously been quite awkward. How old? How far can we go back to look to the origins of humanity? If you go strictly from the Bible, the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. And geology was raising some very awkward facts about the antiquity of the planet and of life on Earth, that rather than thousands of years old, it is billions of years old. And that challenges the church. So as this grip started to loosen, the Enlightenment started to come in and feel freer to ask some of these questions. And so you started to get antiquarians. Antiquarianism is people who would collect antiquities and display them and organize them and try and understand them. This was started off even as sort of late Renaissance interest in the classical periods in Greece and Rome. But then people started to turn their attention to other places, sometimes local, sometimes far-flung. So you had excavations of Stonehenge in England, you had Karnak in France, you had then people starting to go into and rediscover the Middle East, and this was part of the interaction between Europe and other parts of the world. And of course these brought back artifacts to museums in Europe and America. And one of them, a Christian Thompson at the National Museum in Denmark, in Copenhagen, he was a museum keeper who was trying to organize his collection of objects. And he noticed some patterns, that things that were sort of older and looked older and were older technology were of a particular type of material. And through time, different types of technologies were developed that allowed for different types of material to be used, particularly metals. And so he is the one who divided up his collection based on stone artifacts being the earliest, then bronze artifacts being the next latest, and then the Iron Age materials being later still. And it wasn't just that he was organizing these things. He also saw that the technology also related to ways of organizing your social system. That Stone Age communities in the past also had different types of animals that went with them, wild animals that were hunted. And then the Bronze Age was not just taming metals from ores, but it was also taming animals and taming plants and settling down into permanent villages. And then the Iron Age, more sophisticated still in technology, but also more sophisticated and complex in social structure. And so he not just organized his artifacts, but also explicitly linked those artifacts and the collections, the assemblages, to ways that people lived their lives in the past and how social evolution was taking place. So this is all part of academia's discovery in the Age of Enlightenment that humans were actually not always what we see today. And this started in the early 1800s with irrefutable evidence of human artifacts contextually found in excavations with animal bones of extinct animal bones, of extinct animals. So that is something that a creationist viewpoint of the world, that everything's made all at once and nothing changes and all the animals that were created at one time are still here, that can't be true with that evidence. But it's not just animals that were extinct. In 1857, the first Neanderthal skull proved that there were pre-modern humans, that evolution didn't just take place in terms of plants, animals, and geology, but humans were also evolving, that we weren't always here, and we came from someplace. So that's a big step to make. And the mechanisms for how that evolutionary process work, just a couple of years later in 1859, started to have its first establishment when Charles Darwin published his magnum opus on the origin of species, and Charles Lyell also was publishing on the depth of geological time and humans in that place. And then in 1865, Lubbock established not just Stone Age, but also Neolithic and Paleolithic. So Neolithic means the new Stone Age, so that's more recent, and Paleolithic is the old Stone Age, so going much further back in time, including and going back to pre-humans. So the Neolithic will only be humans, but Paleolithic goes back to human origins. Now, this all sounds great, right? But as you should probably know by now, I hope, the 19th century was not full of great ideas. These are all pretty great ideas, but there was a lot of bad stuff going on. Europe was expanding around the world, colonizing places, subjugating them. In many places there was still slavery. There was eventually, in extending into the 20th century, there was even the concept of eugenics, that we should weed out all the bad genes, possibly even by exterminating whole groups of people that we deem as undesirable. Not good stuff. And archaeology, because it's a humanistic discipline, it's interested in humans, it was not spared some of these bad ideas filtering into that. We have to be very careful that archaeology is not used for nefarious purposes. So archaeologists working around the world, especially in the imperial periods, could be motivated to try and reinforce those imperial systems, that creating a hierarchy of cultures with Europe at the top is great for imperialists. It's just not true, though. And also, uncontrolled excavations, before we had established all of those rules that we talked about and in the last chapter about how you do surveys, excavations, analysis, these were being established in the 19th century, and some people didn't follow really any guidelines or any rules, none of them had really been firmly established, so everybody was doing their own individual things, some of them better than others. But you also had people that really weren't interested in the archaeology or the interest in telling the story of people of the past. They were just interested in the stuff. And antiquarians were interested in collecting stuff. So you had looters by treasure hunters, some of which claimed to be archaeologists, some of which just didn't care. So you had a lot of destruction of antiquity in the 19th century as well. There was also an interest in connecting to the ancient Greeks because the Greeks were Europeans, and there had been a drift into the North African and Middle Eastern cultures as being really pretty interesting and important, but they're not Europeans. So how is that possible? And so this racist ideology that was behind 19th century colonialism was filtering into a bias that the ancient Greeks did so much. Now they did. I don't want to denigrate what the Greeks did, but they're part of a process too. They came from somewhere as well. And so there was often too many connections to try and filter things through the Greeks to the rest of Europeans to create a system or an understanding where Europeans were at the top of the world, the global human hierarchy. Also, especially in the United States, interest in places like the Middle East was motivated by trying to confirm biblical events. And this is putting the cart before the horse. This is deciding, I know the truth before I even go excavate. First of all, if you know the truth before you excavate, don't excavate because you're destroying it. But second, that's not science. Science doesn't go in with a predetermined answer to the questions. You have to collect data and then you decide what the evidence, based on what the evidence says. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we get to those decisions in a moment. So all of these justified oppression, colonialism, racism, you may be surprised to know that some of the architects of things like the Nazis' final solution and the Third Reich were archaeologists. It's terrible, and I hate this legacy about my profession. But Gustav Kosina, it was a famous archaeologist from Germany in the first half of the 20th century who was talking about the Indo-Aryan expansion. This is something we still talk about. There are groups of people that migrated out of the Caucasus region and went into both India and into Europe. But Kosina established this as there was a first kingdom, there was a second kingdom, and there was a third kingdom. The Third Reich is an archaeological concept. And he saw that these were the Third Reich was the purest, genetically speaking, people that came from this pedigree of high civilization, and these undesirable groups in Northern Europe, where they saw that homeland was infiltrated by undesirable people, and they needed to be eliminated. And that is the basis for the genocide in World War II, was this concept that there was a master race. And that is an intrinsically archaeological idea that came from archaeology. And it's wrong. And it is It's a stain on this discipline. Not just archaeology, it's a stain on humanity. So archaeologists are humans, and as a consequence, they're also susceptible to some of the problems that humans have. And so this is where we need to be very aware of our biases coming into this, because whoever owns the past owns the present. Where do you think property comes from? Property comes from a history of being at a place, or you can demonstrate that I've possessed this thing for a long time. So if you have an archaeological argument that says these people have been here before these people, then you can talk about ownership of land and places and the right to be places, and it becomes a very powerful tool for exploiting other people. So archaeologists aren't just in an ivory tower that are just talking to other archaeologists or publishing nice books that sit on a coffee table. They can be used to implement policies, and they can also be used for very bad purposes. So we do need to be very careful when we're using the archaeology, that we're not doing so in a way that affects people badly. We want to tell the truth, but we don't want to bring our own inaccurate biases into that telling. Okay, I'm going to take a break here for a moment, and we're going to get back into developing the methods and the theories for how we create archaeological interpretations in a moment. Okay, I'll see you in a second.